Woman by Cindee Pascoe. Preface. I don't know one woman who at some time in her life hasn't suffered angst about her body, who hasn't yearned for changes which would make her more beautiful. In our culture, no woman feels beautiful enough. I have a concern about this and how it has played out in the explosion in numbers of women seeking cosmetic procedures, particularly younger and younger women, even girls who are exposed to and influenced by the influx of images pouring from the internet and other visual media. From one vantage point, of course, it is none of my business what anyone does with their body. We all have the freedom and the right to do what we want to our bodies. But it has triggered me, made me uneasy, and somehow responsible to examine this phenomenon which has seduced so many women. I suppose the deeper question is why? Why do we do these things? Why do we want to be different than we are? I am very interested in exploring authenticity. What allows it? What prevents it? Why do we, as women, deny ourselves our selves? What is authenticity? Honesty, the unadulterated truth, the simple isness of anything. I used to use the word integrity, thinking it was the same. I now see integrity as a little bit pompous, a little bit trying, a slight bit of pushing on the self to be a better self. It has a sense of formality that is not there with authentic. Integrity is sort of like your best self. Authenticity is yourself, just as you are right now. We are relaxed and easy around authentic people. We might not like a particular flavor of authenticity, but we trust it to be being what it is. There are many ways to be inauthentic. The focus on the body as the locus of authenticity is a first-level approach to a complex of hiding maneuvers which we all as women employ. Of course, men do too. This is a human protective mechanism. In this writing, I am choosing to speak of women and their bodies, as that is where the more obvious imbalance lies. I'm fortunate to live in an off-the-grid community which is inhabited by a wide and deliciously wild array of people, 30 of which are women. The ease and acceptance of which these women approach their physical naturalness and that of each other has been a refreshing taste of what is possible. I feel it's a healthy sign of genuine feminine evolvement. Granted, we have yet to deal with many other manifestations of inauthenticity stemming from our varied emotional and trauma-induced personal histories. Still, it's a start. But I have many friends and family, including young granddaughters, who are under other pressures to conform to the dictates of the wider environment. In this writing, I yearn to reach them, to suggest another way, to align as women, woman, to love and support one another, to brave our authentic selves. There is so much to say and so many ways to say it. In this writing, I paint with wide brush strokes, using sweeping statements, making claims and generalizations that can be shot full of holes, even by my own reasoning, if I would choose to leave no stone unturned, address every possible exception. But I know of no other way to open up the subject other than just saying it like I am saying it. I'm speaking to the heart, to the passion. I am counting implicitly on the reader's own personal experience to validate this. or not. To stop and reference every statement I am making will not work. A certain momentum must be maintained. I feel I am as qualified as any woman to make these assertions. I have been female for 73 years, a menstruating woman for 36 of those years, an older woman for 20 more, and now entering crondom. I've had 2 children, now 5 grandchildren, 3 husbands, numerous lovers. My life's work has focused on women, our lives, our issues, investigating the essence of who we are. Unless I push upon the barriers I see and experience, examine the extremes, there's no way to come back to the middle. If I don't speak it as truth, I can't feel it as truth. Once I feel it, once I see it, I am a choice to change it. Until then, I am wrapped in the cocoon of ignorance and denial. We can blame the patriarchy, or we can blame capitalism for our behaviors. But when it comes down to it, we are doing these things to ourselves. The age-old expectations upon women by men, and of women upon themselves, in regard to their bodies and their sexuality, have hampered woman's ability to come to terms with herself on her own terms. From her earliest childhood, resulting from centuries of conditioning and tradition, and through genetic imprinting, she has been viewed and been taught to view herself through the male gaze, virtually closing her off from what would have developed as her natural and intuitive knowing. As little girls, we love to show ourselves, to display our beauty. This is our birthright. Shiny things and beautiful things attract us, and we know instinctively we are as pretty as a flower, or as graceful as a fairy, or as bright as a star in the sky, unless we are judged lacking by the adults around us. Displays by young girls are innocent, adorable, and heartful, without guile, but at younger and younger ages, girls are placed on the assembly line of sexiness, inundated with Barbie dolls and makeup kits, adult-themed designer clothes and mini high heels. Playing dress-ups has never been so serious. This deluge stunts a girl's potential to gradually grow into the next version of her individuality, her own unique form of beauty. Beauty is standardized before a young girl has even developed the mind and logic to question it. So much of this obsession with beauty, particularly since the advent of advertising, is what has been sold to us as normal and necessary to qualify as a desirable or even a hygienic woman. I remember my mother, who was born in the 1920s, sharing with me that shaving one's legs was quite novel during her adolescence. It became normative only after a number of years of Gillette Safety Razor's sales campaign to subtly shame women who didn't shave. A bright idea by a young executive who realized a lot more razors could be sold if women were buying them as well as men. It worked. And now shaving one's legs is just what we do. Or perhaps we do it one better. Electrolysis for permanent hair removal. Killing the hair follicles also works. I want to make it clear in the beginning, I am not condemning any woman who has chosen this path of increasing her self-confidence. I wouldn't dare throw that stone. I have my own list of fix-its. In my early 50s, I had a Botox treatment to reduce forehead lines. It backfired, and I looked like a Neanderthal for 3 months while I waited for the nerves to regrow. I also once tried to laser erase the lines around my eyes, which also took the color from my skin, causing me for a full year to look like I'd worn sunglasses my entire adult life. And even now I am not yet out of the woods. I find myself wanting to rub a little dab of lipstick onto my cheeks before I FaceTime my grandchildren. The term the male gaze has been around for almost half a century. It has established and named a feature of civilization that, until its naming, went largely unacknowledged. The male gaze is humankind's default mechanism that causes all cultures to view all life through the male lens, making woman naturally an object of visual and erotic pleasure, and therefore also potentially, from a patriarchal worldview, a source of temptation or sexual downfall. There have always been those few women who have balked at this limitation of being other-defined. Most have paid a heavy price. During the Inquisition, resistors were burned at the stake. Those women who have reached for a fuller selfhood over the last century, through attempts at obtaining basic rights, such as the right to vote or humane working conditions, and who were partially successful, were punished with physical abuse and imprisonment, not to mention the shunning of many by their own families. Later women who attempted to take on masculine characteristics in order to gain respect and value in the workplace were ridiculed as dykes or man-haters. Younger women who have claimed sexual freedom and agency have been judged as sluts, or women who have betrayed womanhood itself by flagrantly displaying and playing out their passions. Most recently, women have gathered to protest, railing against systems and institutions as well as abusive individual men. Though these valiant attempts at bringing herself to maturity as a female being have been made, woman is still, it seems, virtually flailing around in the dark. Little has really changed. Statistics on domestic violence, sexual abuse, and the welfare of women worldwide sadly bring the facts to bear. There is no doubt that her rage is righteous, fully justified, but little of her activism has borne fruit. And regardless of her efforts or successes, most talk of feminism now draws shrugs. It's a tired, old territory, irrelevant to the complex of otherdom presented by ethnicity, disability, or LGBTQI issues. It's now a post-feminist world. Feminism as a movement has primarily worked in one way. Women have used the tools men use: argument, reason, intellectual excellence, to secure positions in government and industry. Generally, any advances have been slight and have been secured through playing strictly by men's rules of engagement. Woman, in this case, is valued in that she can walk the tightrope to please the patriarchy while still managing to play out her femininity in at least appearance and dress. And it helps if she is also charming. All our systems are hardwired by the patriarchy, so she will be playing this game for a very long time if she continues to seek transformation with the patriarchy's approval. The temptation is to blame men as the obvious representatives and representations of the patriarchal body for a system so overly masculinized. And at certain times and in certain situations, this has been a just accusation. But as consciousness expands and agency is recognized, perhaps it is time for a deeper look. Perhaps men have not insisted, only responded. Perhaps we women have accustomed them to expect us to feign and fawn. Could we ourselves have exaggerated and helped cement the male gaze? Woman's history casts a shadow not easy for the subconscious to dispel. Centuries-old customs confusing and conflating beauty, purity, or modesty included what are now considered by Western civilizations as barbaric procedures. As recently as the mid-1900s and over the previous 10 centuries, the binding of a young Chinese girl's feet to prevent their growth, for aesthetic purposes, caused deformity, crippling, pain, and sometimes death by gangrene for millions of Chinese women. Many African and Middle Eastern cultures still practice mutilating of a young girl's genitals or removal of the clitoris, preventing normal reproductive and sexual functions, maiming her for life, not to mention denying her her natural sexual pleasure. An estimated 200 million women currently living have undergone some form of genital cutting. Western societies may call these procedures torturous and inhumane, but Western societies have their own cunning forms of cultural conformity, in our case sanctioned and sanitized by the cosmetic medical professions. Tattooing of lips and eyebrows, piercings of sundry body parts, cutting our faces open to tighten loose skin, placing artificial padding into our chests, pumping our buttocks full of fat suctioned from our bellies, the Brazilian butt lift, or BBL, which, incidentally, has a mortality rate of 3 per 1,000, a result of embolism when fat cells enter the bloodstream of the large veins of the buttocks, causing strokes. What is called double jaw surgery is the most quickly growing reconstructive cosmetic procedure in Korea for women wishing to reduce the squareness of the jaw. The risks are many: over 6 months recovery, loss of facial sensation, pain on eating from misalignment of teeth, or inability to smile. But the price is worth paying. Asian women are flocking to be slender-faced, hence beautiful. The list goes on. Women, through the centuries, in their need to fit into a patriarchal society, have chosen these things to do to their bodies in an attempt to satisfy male expectations or gain special favor from the men of their cultures. Deductive reasoning implies that we don't trust that men will love us just as we are, that our only power is in seducing them to desire us sexually, and that we must compete with each other to do it. Paradoxically, from what we can tell historically, body adornment was more male than female. Designating power and status, tattoos and piercings and ritual scarrings were signs of strength and masculinity. Women were bestowed jewelry and their own markings, scars and tattooing, as signs of initiation or as human displays of the wealth or status of their male owners. Shamanic costuming was worn to honor or to evoke divine power from specific animal totems or deities. Egyptian royalty, male and female, wore elaborate makeup to designate divine status. The kings and courts of Europe added to this sense of status and the theatrical, with both men and women wearing wigs, face powder, and often sexually explicit clothing. This separated them from the common people, who did not have the luxury of resources or time to decorate their bodies. Once reserved for royalty and deity, glamour, the original meaning of which referred to otherworldly enchantment, spells, or magic, has now been appropriated by Madison Avenue, tempting women to be alluring, fascinating, and attractive at all times. Women themselves have been enchanted by these savvy advertisers, falling for the promise that a well-made-up and preferably wrinkle-free face and body-accentuating attire can draw fame or wealth, or entice or keep true love. This insistence on appearing glamorous in everyday life has further burdened women, who now feel compelled to measure up to Madison Avenue mannequins in order to avoid being considered frumpy or unkempt, even on a run to the grocery store. An aside, but interesting. I read once that when the natural gestures of the face are inhibited by Botox, the body can no longer trigger the release of the chemicals and hormones which give us our moods, and hence our feelings. If we paralyze the muscles that produce our frowns, our smiles, our raised eyebrows, we slowly rob ourselves of our full range of emotion. We become as immobile in our feelings as we have made our faces. I don't know if this is true or not, but it makes sense. It is a certain kind of self-denial, for sure. As childish as it seems, as impossible as it could be, as illogical as it surely is, our collective neurosis tells us we want to be the fairest in the land. And yet we become the evil queen to ourselves and other women when we suspect we, or they, do not measure up to the perfection of a Snow White. It seems as though the liberation women have acquired through their equality in financial and some social arenas has translated into using that freedom and wealth to further satisfy the male gaze. Progress and female success measured by breast size or the glamorous mirage of endless youth. Something is very wrong here. What is missing, I believe, is woman's knowing of her natural power. Her heart and her feelings are seen as private, personal, insignificant, useless to real life, to the bigger life of the culture, valuable only to children, animals, perhaps her own family and dearest friends. These are not seen as powerful tools of communication, which, if utilized with compassion and consciousness, could bring awareness and needed input, balance, and a much-needed contrasting perspective to modern life. She instead has been so conditioned by thousands of years of patriarchy that she has forgotten who she is. She herself sees through the male gaze. She herself values herself in this way. She discounts her true gifts, even hiding and deprecating them, unknowingly or unconsciously compromising herself, remaining blindly loyal to the patriarchy. Instead of growing into her realness, which would cause the blossoming of a genuine and authentic desire to please her beloved through the gifts of her innate beauty and her freed sexuality, her natural inclinations warp, and she takes on the persona demanded by the patriarchy. When finally the pinch becomes unbearable, she rises up. Usually it takes a number of women rising at once to generate the momentum and the courage to plead for change. Wanting to be seen, to be valued, she has tried to fight fire with fire. She has tried to counter the patriarchy by beating it at its own game, by harnessing her own masculine abilities to join it. Different to the winner-loser mentality of the patriarchy, she has always seen this fighting as a means to an end which, by female inclusion, would value both genders. Winning, for her, has always been for the benefit of all. But the medium is the message. The patriarchy, formed as hierarchy, cannot envision such an end result. To the patriarchy, the threat is dismantlement of male entitlement and privilege, and the terrifying possibility of women in control. Just as the majority of women are blind to the effects of the male gaze, so are men blind to their subconscious fears of feminine power. Certain any power must be power over. Woman's reason and countermeasures will never win here. As long as women try to change men and men's attitudes, no real progress can be made. Woman has to see herself at cause, not at effect. As cause, not as victim to the patriarchy. Like the grown elephant who as a calf had its foot roped and was taught to stay within the radius of a leash by early training, and as an adult behemoth could easily break the string, claim its freedom, and walk off into the jungle, woman is loath to wander from man's world for fear of punishment or abandonment. She may chafe at her binding, but is still oblivious to her own agency. Evolving woman knows it is upon herself to find the key to change, but like the domesticated elephant, has not yet discovered she is giving man a power over her that he in reality does not hold. Man, not realizing his ancestors have thus trained woman, is blind to her dilemma, and alternately confused or angry at her finger-pointing. Man will never please woman until she pleases herself. Man will never see woman until she sees herself, and on her own terms. Woman today, in her evolutionary development, is like a 12-year-old girl just beginning to claim her life, experimenting with herself, flirting with daddy, trying on mummy's jewelry and makeup, wanting to get any attention to know she exists as a singular being. It is all she knows to do. When a child, all her day-to-day examples were versions of the trained elephant. She learns young, even before language, through facial cues and bodily gestures, that all the attention she gets, any admiration she garners, come from her obedience to the male gaze. She has been so enculturated and civilized that her inborn nature, her wildness, is seen as threatening, suspect, and quickly trained out of her by her keepers. She herself, as she grows, and particularly as her hormones begin to affect her, is confused or overwhelmed, sometimes even terrified by it. Her natural nature starved, she grows up knowing something is wrong, but puts that label upon her own being. Where has she sinned? Gone off target? Not complied? Been too moody? Or too hysterical? Too much? She won't use these words, and she may even rebel against such labels and defiantly refuse them. But, like the docile elephant, or, if she protests, the whipped one, the judgments, the disgust of her society, survival itself eventually force her back upon the path of conformity. Those women who dare to break the bonds are outcast one way or another, their small enclaves providing some love and respite one to another. So where to now? What can evolution's adolescent woman do differently? The consideration of any contrasting female gaze is just barely being explored by a few women who have decided it might be worth looking to see if there is such a thing. What would a female gaze be? Just as male and female can, and have often been, considered opposites, such a way to contrast is not helpful. Their respective qualities and characteristics can complement, but even this estimation is set itself by the default of a believed to be legitimate male gaze, when in actuality it is a lopsided way of seeing that has been learned. Men as the viewers, as well as women as the objects, suffer under its constraints. If there is to be a female gaze, certainly it could not be an opposite. Perhaps it is more a case of it being discovered. For what would a female lens be, considering that the eyes of women have been trained to see only through the male gaze? Like a pair of wrong-fitting eyeglasses, woman must take off the spectacles of the male gaze and let the blur be for a moment, and then slowly begin to see, to feel, to know from a new place within herself, a place untainted by the male gaze. I hypothesize that, unlike the universalism of the male gaze, or perhaps better said, the unseen acceptance of it as the universal gaze, the female gaze would be personal. Rather than being a cultural construct, it would be an individual owning of self. It would begin with a woman asking the question, who might I be if I hadn't been programmed by the male gaze? This is purely hypothetical, of course, and impossible to really know, as there is no pure environment or parent that has not been already affected by the male gaze. Women have tried to do this, but more often than not, their attempts have backfired or been grossly misunderstood. There was an attempt by second-wave feminists to see themselves newly. Workshops abounded, where women would gather and look with mirrors at their own genitals. Though seen as primitive and laughable by many today, these undertakings were serious and very frightening for women of that time. Few women had ever done such a simple thing. Her genitals were not her own to see. Her body was a dark, mysterious territory. It belonged to man, or at least a man. Though a phenomenon of half a century ago, many women still feel repugnant about their own genitals. Despite the attempt to fashion flowers out of the female genitals, artist Judy Chicago, or female genitals out of flowers, some viewers of Georgia O'Keeffe, the female genitals remain more a subject of pornography or voyeurism to most people. This is not to say that a woman's genitals should be considered in a blasé way, likened to less triggering body parts as, say, her knees and her elbows. The other reason a woman's genitals are taboo is that they hold the secrets to life and to pleasure not only of this world, but as a gateway to something numinous, ecstatic, dare we say divine. If a man wants a baby, she can make one. If he wants an orgasm, she can provide him one. that the sexual function is also potentially divine would be seen as more controversial, though I suspect every woman intuitively knows this and yearns for that joining, whether she can verbalize it or not, whether she can claim it or not. Rarely under the male gaze does she have any opportunity to explore a deeper sexual potential. At a young age, she learns her purpose is to entice and please men, to sexually satisfy, and, hopefully, gain some sense of value, and, if she's lucky, some sexual satisfaction herself. Millennial women may claim a more open and enlightened sexual nature, but again, how much of her pleasure is at the behest or approval of man's lust in seeing her body in ecstasy? For all her claim of female glorification, her terms of endearment in hip-hop or cool kids parlance for her sisters, biatch, bitch, or hoe, whore, are suspiciously denigrating. And across even middle-aged generations, the use of cunt to signify the worst of human nature is considered normal. Woman may protest, but woman's body is owned and defined by man. While her face, her breasts, her hair, her body proportions have always been man's purview, his to judge and to define as beautiful or ugly, his to draw, sculpt, photograph, or film according to his fantasies. And she has done her best to diet, to dye, to implant, to burn, to shave, and paralyze those body parts to his satisfaction. Now a billion-dollar industry of pornography has laid bare her vulva and vagina, her anus and her buttocks. Even woman's most hidden and secret, and perhaps sacred territory has been taken by man. Unlike the old second-wave feminists who bravely gazed with fresh eyes at their own bodies, today's young woman who wishes to remain feminine currency within the bounds of her culture cannot afford the luxury of ignorance or innocence. She must be privy to pornography's ideals. From budding puberty on, she must now examine her body parts very carefully, being sure to fit the norm of the hairless, perfectly shaped and puffed vulva, evenly sized labial lips, bleached anus, shapely and muscular buttocks. Maintenance, attention is required, and alas, sometimes these parts too need a little nipping and tucking, a little work to comply with industry standards. She also learns from pornography how to sexually respond and what she will be expected to perform and to expect to have performed upon her in the sex act. Nothing is hers. She has had everything stripped away. She has been given the male gaze manual for life itself. True stories. A girl of 18, certain her breasts are too small, receives the gift of a surgery for full breast implants from her father at her high school graduation. Her friends are envious and applauding. She's gone from an A cup to a D. A girl of 14, just entering puberty, begs her mother to take her for her first Brazilian wax. She explains that she will die of embarrassment if she begins her sexual life with pubic hair. These rites of passage, as were Chinese foot binding and African genital mutilation, both performed in both cases at the behest of the mothers, are the kinds of things we are now willing to do to our daughters' bodies, in order that our daughters will, like us before them, with our shaved legs and bleached hair, satisfy the male gaze. I'd like to relate here a life-changing experience I have had that, now I see, directly points out the potential to women of adopting and adapting to what I see as the female gaze. I'll need to give a little background. In my 40s, the early 1990s, I was adamantly and passionately feminist. As a journalist, I had explored and consumed everything I could find that related to the feminist journey. I erratically jumped between radical feminist theology, Mary Daly, to Wiccan goddess and nature rituals, Starhawk, to political social movements, Riane Eisler. I spoke my views as a featured journalist and in a newspaper column, often writing on women's issues, and through the prompting of a local woman's psychologist, I began to run a women's reading group. For 2 years, 12 of us grew close and traveled far together on those Tuesday evenings, exploring a wide array of feminist literature. During that time, I attended a week-long writing workshop held by the Women's International Writing Guild in New York. There, at the empty Skidmore College campus, it was summer holidays and all the students had gone home, over 100 women gathered from around the world to share their writing and to inspire one another. Poets, journalists, novelists, playwrights, diarists, and women who just journaled and wanted to be with like minds. We had space, we had privacy. We had 7 full days. It was all women. Perhaps by design or just luck, there was no male presence. This was the closest I had ever come to an all-woman event that was specifically dedicated to ourselves as women. The depths we went to, the tears we cried, the laughter we shared, the glory of ourselves, of our creativity, of our love, of our talent and abilities to share and collaborate. I came away from that week a different woman, perhaps for the first time, really a woman. I returned to Australia and, gathering the gems of my New York week, immediately formulated my own workshop, determined to share this magical experience with the women of my reading group. I did so. These women implored me to open the workshop to other women, which I did, and eventually I designed a men's version, which I also facilitated. The workshops were designed to balance the masculine and feminine. I held the patriarchy responsible for the imbalance, but felt no animosity toward individual men. It was obvious they were equal victims, though they were less clear than feminist women about what that meant. Closely following this experience, I heard of a women's initiation workshop that was to be held in the Atherton Tablelands, outside of Cairns. 12 women were to be led through a 12-day journey called the Descent of Inanna. 3 women who were self-proclaimed priestesses of the goddess would be directing and supporting us. One of the bullet points in the small magazine ad stressed the absolute assurance of privacy and lack of any male interference at the remote location at which the workshop would be held. Something clicked in me. Though travel arrangements were complicated and I had work commitments to juggle, I had an enthusiastic and automatic yes to attend. A prerequisite was to read Jungian analyst Sylvia Pereira's Descent to the Goddess, a way of initiation for women, based on the ancient Sumerian myth of the death and rebirth of Inanna, Isis. The myth tells of how the beautiful young queen Inanna must give up all her human treasures and meet her dark sister, her terrifying, ugly and dark shadow before being reborn as her true virgin self. Rather than reveal my experience of the initiation process itself, which I would not want to preempt for any woman who has the opportunity to undergo it, I would like to share how the manless setting set the tone and was, in retrospect, the essential context for all of the content. As overblown and preposterous as it sounds, if I had not experienced it, I would never have believed how deeply influenced we are as women just by the simple presence of men, and how inhibited we are even knowing there might be a chance we could be viewed by a random man. We don't give much thought to the fact that men and women move about the world together. From childhood on, we coexist. We see the other sex, and though there is difference, we don't question it or feel the need to separate from it. Brothers and sisters are raised together. Schools generally are coeducational, and those that aren't still usually have teachers or staff of both sexes. Few boys or girls are in long-term, single, respective gender situations. By the time we are men and women, we take for granted our mutual cohabitation of our world. Even in societies in which there is a separation of the sexes at times, the presence of the other sex is constant and pervasive. The matriarchal institutions we are familiar with are male-dominated, formed as a lower tier of hierarchy, still to be at the service of male systems, say convents, nunneries or harems, even nursing until recently. They are therefore, even though all female, still patriarchal. The women involved, even if no men are physically present, are still, to borrow from A Handmaid's Tale, under his eye. Those women of the past who did claim their space and who had freedom to be themselves, mainly older women, were able to because they were no longer of use or interest to men, as they were no longer maidens, potential wives, or mothers. Usually relegated to the outskirts of society, they were able finally to be themselves, to let their hair go free, to wear what they wanted, to participate with nature and its animals, with herbs and spiritual traditions. Feared because of their wholeness, their lack of need for men, yet respected for exactly the same thing, they were called crones, witches, hags. These labels are now considered denigrating, but their etymology belies their initial recognition: crown, wit, and wisdom. Only when the witches were deemed evil and destroyed by the patriarchal Catholic Church did these appellations take on the meaning of what we attribute to them today. The setting for the descent was an 1.5-hour drive out of Cannes. I landed at the airport and met the other women who had flown in. We were all women of around the same age, most in our 40s. The organizers had rented a van, and we all drove to the destination, a one-story, rambling, labyrinthian house on a large property, kilometers from a main road and from any surrounding properties. As is common in Australia, the rural property had at least 3 gates to block off sections for livestock. So every few kilometers the driver had to stop and unlatch and relatch each gate. As tiresome as this may get over time, it does give the property residents the added security of no nosy strangers just happening by. In our case, we noted, or remembered later, that we truly were isolated, for purposes of the workshop, cloistered from the outside world. The grounds around the house itself were lush, blooming with summer blossoms and green grass from the recent rains. A small stream surrounded by large flat rocks burbled through the verdant landscape, and the trees and foliage offered many shady areas in which to sit or lounge. We were told we had free rein of the garden, and, in fact, to consider it part of the ritual space. The home was beautiful, open and spacious, furnished in simple style. We were assigned our sleeping places, a few women to different areas of the house, some in the bedrooms, and a few on mattresses in corners of the main rooms. After we had settled our belongings, we gathered to be told the format of the 12 days to follow. We would spend the first 7 days together, each making the ritual objects which would be used in the initiation ceremony itself. The 7 days would be spent in relative quiet, but in close company of one another. From the beginning, in the background played a strange but compelling music, with the strong, low-toned voices of women, all in a minor key. Eventually, we could hear the story and the characters in the songs, all based on the myth of the descent of Inanna to the underworld. We would rise at early dawn and perform a ritual dance to one of these songs, the dance to honor Venus, the morning star, as the goddess Inanna. As the days passed, this ritual became more and more meaningful, our synchronized movements truly feeling sacred and powerful, as though we were communing directly with nature and the cosmos, as though we were the cause itself of the sunrise. After a simple breakfast of fruit and toast, we moved to a communal area, a covered veranda attached to the house, laid with cushions and draped mattresses. Our 3 facilitators were gentle, but direct in their instructions. We had been told to bring a few meters of fabric and any trims or jewelry or decorative items we might want to include in our ritual objects, the garments of Inanna. One of the facilitators began to read to us the story of Inanna. We listened while we worked our hands on designing our objects, each in total freedom to create in any way we pleased. The soft summer breezes flowed through, and the heat of the day began to rise. The story ended, but the background music continued softly. We murmured and laughed with one another as we saw the diverse interpretations of the ritual objects our hands were forming. We each acknowledged that we were enjoying the process and were feeling quite attached to our little creations. After our lunch, we had an afternoon break to roam in the gardens, swim in the stream, or visit with each other. Soon we all felt quite close to one another. We shared our stories and our lives, our reasons for wanting to delve into such an odd thing as a woman's initiation. The facilitators remained quite distant from us. We knew they were working constantly in the background in order to handle our basic needs, cooking, cleaning, preparing the space, leading us through the few basic rituals, repeatedly reading the myth to us, setting the quiet but comfortable tone. But they did not reveal to us their own stories or their own journeys. I realized later that this was requisite in order to hold open the space for our own coming into ourselves, our own discovery of our individual gifts. They would offer no template, but took turns guiding our days and softly encouraging our blossoming as we began to be more open with one another and with our creative process. By the end of the 3rd day, we were shedding our clothes in the humidity and warmth of the veranda. A top would be dropped, a sarong shed. No one noticed or thought anything of it. It was an issue of practical comfort. At the time, we did not think of it as freedom. We did not feel self-conscious or shy. Our bodies were becoming almost amorphous, becoming one body, all working in its differentiated ways. We often would not bother to cover for lunch or for our garden wanderings. In retrospect, and from back in the normal world, where I must wear my male gaze glasses, I would see this as bizarre, exhibitionist, even risque. But now I know that this is only because the normal world is inhabited and dominated by men. The rules of the patriarchy may be invisible, but they are strict and unbending. There may be no man in sight, but like the trained elephant, a woman cannot dare to take such a chance as to bare herself for her comfort or ease. It is both licentious and dangerous. And while she fears men, she equally risks being shamed by other women of the patriarchy, most of whom also wear the male gaze glasses, and who view other women's bodies comparatively or contemptuously. As our days passed, this freedom in the body slowly transferred and transmuted into a deeper freedom of mind, a gentle opening of the heart. Tenderness toward the other women and towards myself grew. We began to see each other, beyond our bodies, beyond shape or face or clothing or makeup or jewelry, those things that would have distinguished us in our normal lives. We offered one another loving touch with a massage or a foot rub. We swam naked together in the stream and laid in the sun, chatting while we dried. We walked arm in arm. We combed each other's hair. We slowly and very gradually felt ourselves turning into goddesses, while at the same time becoming more human and more woman than we had thought possible. Slowness, slowing down, losing track of time and routines, feeling soft and open and available one to another. Our speech slowed. Our movements slowed. We developed a simple grace and kindness one to another. And all of this recognition was wordless and completely unrevolutionary. Even now, in my attempt to put it into words, I know there is no skill, no one feeling I can evoke capable of translating the untranslatable. This was a deep, quiet experience. We were home, each woman completely individual, and yet each exactly the same. As the initiation progressed, more arduous phases were introduced. Our closeness and our comfort had developed a strength and faith in ourselves which held us in good stead for the moments of grief and terror we ceremonially experienced. We held the space for one another as our bodies and emotions endured the cathartic releases necessary to open space for new consciousness. Again, we were happy to be far from the eyes and ears of civilization. We knew in our process we must sound like mad women or banshees from the netherworld. At the end of the 12 days, we had all so softened and yet had become so individually centered and anchored in what I now see as the feminine that we felt we had been reborn to a new life. The last day was spent discussing how best to navigate our re-entry into our lives post-workshop. Our facilitators, now truly recognized by us initiates as indeed priestesses, were now open and sharing. There were no answers to this, But we all, to a woman, felt the sad and ominous weight of needing to shut ourselves down, to re-harden and re-defend as we took up our mantles of motherhood, wifedom, or our professional roles. It was impossible to be what we really were, what we had discovered about ourselves in the world. Our knowing would need to be private and relegated to a quiet place in our hearts and minds, to flower perhaps at some later date, some later time. And now, as I see some 30 years later, most likely some later lifetime. Leaving the property was both sad and fearful. As we passed back through the gates, tears came, and we held each other's hands, preparing for what was to come. There was little conversation. As we entered the city, I felt like an alien who had just landed on another planet. I felt the shock and wonder of seeing the people, all so busy and preoccupied with their lives. The airport was a hubbub of loudspeakers and wheels. The men particularly looked hard and unseeing. When their eyes did alight on me, I could see their gazes held a curiosity, but also an offhand ownership, then a dismissal of sorts at my obvious disinterest in engaging with them. I had never named this before, had never even noticed it. Now I could see it. I could also see how, before, I often would engage the gazer with a smile or a quick meeting of eyes. I felt I owed this to any man who had honored me with his attention, even though I rarely wished to have anything to do with him. Wasn't this simply being polite, being a nice woman? But now it was different. I actually felt invaded, almost nauseated at how unseen and disrespected she was. The she that was now housed in my body, in my being. I wanted to hide, to find some place safe to breathe freely, to loosen my limbs and feel just a bit of how I had felt walking through the garden over the last 12 days. I felt an extreme tiredness, a welling up of an unknown grief. I tucked it in, sucked it up, and boarded my plane. Although I had not missed or even thought of a glass of wine over the whole time away, I ordered one when the flight attendant asked. Anything to calm my nerves, blank me out from this discomfort. So much feeling was rushing through my body. I was having awarenesses that I could not name, but knew. I felt the horror and blindness of our time, of our culture, the ignorance and misunderstandings of all of us, men and women, toward the holy feminine, our distrust and suspiciousness of love. I almost wished I had never undertaken this journey, this initiation. I felt like I'd had a reverse lobotomy. I had been given a sense organ. A part of my brain or my heart had been awakened. I could see and feel things that, for most others, did not even exist.